I think I'm having an art attack. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Art Attack with your host, myself, Justin Bua, and art history professor, Lizy Dastin. Lizy Dastin is a professor of art and a professor of art history.
Just art history, not art.
I know, I'm kidding. I just felt it. So today we're going to be talking about Kara Walker, who is a very famous artist. She's had shows everywhere. I've seen her shows. I know that she is very polarizing for a lot of people, and she does work that is by a lot of people's standards very extreme. I don't find it so extreme. You know what I mean? I find it definitely controversial, but it's not exactly Andre Serrano's Piss Christ. I mean, it is, she's dealing with some real shit. She's dealing with slavery. She's dealing with Jim Crow laws. She's dealing with just iconography. It's funny because she mentioned the Cream of Wheaties box and just some artists, back in the days when things weren't racially transparent, people were doing some horrible shit. And even some artists that I love were part of that. Sunbloom, who did what we perceive Kris Kringle or Santa Claus to be. Sunbloom is one of the greatest painters of all time, and he did a lot of that. He did the Aunt Jemima. He did a lot of that old school stuff that we see on products to this day. But Kara kind of exposes the underlying race issues that have not really been talked about, because I think that racism was very much a mallet to the head, and now racism is a pinprick when you're not looking. It's way more subtle. You can get away with it easier, and yet it is the nefarious Bluebeard shadow of society, and she exposes it in mostly silhouettes. She deals with these images almost as cutouts, which has a whole other layer and texture to the conversation and her design. And some of her images are really fucking graphic, and really gnarly. And others are almost like fairy tale and comic booky, So it's the blending of these worlds that collides in something that a lot of people find inflammatory. But I think it's like, hey, this is how I'm telling this story, and this is how I see it. And as a black woman in America coming from Atlanta with my dad who's an artist, like, this is how I see the fucking world, much like I see the world that I paint. So I think it's a real deal artistic perspective and point of view.
I agree with you. And I think that your outlining of her work and her methods and the controversy surrounding both was phenomenal. And you really outlined central themes within Walker's work. And to go back to her practice, she does use silhouettes. And so she's dramatizing the black of the bodies of the figures that she uses, and often the white of the wall behind her. And so that's just another dichotomy between binary extremes, white and black. And a lot of the narratives of her work also embrace that binary logic of race and power. And so I think that there are layers and layers within her work, and I understand why it's controversial, because there's a really thin line between subverting something and pandering to it. And the majority of her critics come from the African American community.
Sure.
And there's one in particular that I know has been very outspoken against Walker's work, and that's a fellow artist, Betty Saar. And it's interesting because Saar will use the Aunt Jemima figure And so does Walker. But the way that they use that figure illustrates the differences within their projects and their practice. So I think that the silhouette is intriguing because typically a silhouette was used by women artists in the 1800s who were hobbyists. And so there is a particular gendered reading to that for me. Also, in a silhouette, the specifics of the face, the character, the psychology of the sitters are minimized. You see the shape of a nose, but you don't see the wrinkles, the folds, the pores. And so it's like she is taking the specifics of history and just kind of smoothing them out.
But at the same time exaggerating them because
Yeah.
she's taking the nose, the wide nose, the big lips, and she's pushing it more to make a point, right? So, and I find it really interesting that, you know, a lot of African American artists are coming out, you know, about her work where it's like, look, this is like freedom of speech. You know, this is art. Like, why can't I say what I'm going to say when I want to say it, how I want to say it? You don't have to look at it, by the way. I get it. You can have an opinion about it too. We all have free speech. But at the same time, isn't what she's doing provocative? Isn't what she's doing making us think? Like, really, isn't it? It's not Audrey Beardsley, which is similar in terms of style, right? The pen and ink, the major silhouettes. It's, you know, it's like that in an allegorical way, but you're taking out all the beauty and you're adding a kind of heavy-handedness to the narrative.
Right, but a truth to a narrative that is ugly. And I think that her work is even closer aligned to Romar Bearden, an artist that we've talked about before, in the cutout nature of the figure. But Bearden's work never receives the criticism that Walker's does because he is celebratory toward the African-American figure and experience. And It's not that Walker isn't, but she's exposing systemic and hideous racism and incest and rape and violence.
And master and servant and all of these, you know, all of that history that we're not necessarily seeing in painting and drawing as much anymore. You know, and she's doing it in that style that seems to be now unique to her, but you know, that is a style that's been going on for forever in terms of silhouettes and cutouts and stuff like that. You even see, not to put her in the same stratosphere whatsoever, but what Swoon does in street art is the same stuff. I mean, she's doing cutouts, pasting it on the wall, and she's doing much more graph-centric, positive-centric artwork. You know what I'm saying?
Right. And the difference within those examples, and I know that you're not equalizing their practice, but that Walker's elimination of any sort of facial details, I think is important because it engages in another dialectic that is an opposite between concealing and revealing, that she is revealing this hideous underbelly that isn't quite so secretive, but that is pernicious. But she's also concealing certain features, and she's concealing the emotion that the figures might feel and that we don't psychologically connect to them. And I think that is actually why viewers are so uncomfortable with her work, because we almost feel complicit, or at least that was my experience in seeing one of her installations at the Broad. Often her work is a totally immersive room. You're not going to see a Kara Walker in a frame. It's always directly applied to the surface of the wall. And often, I think it was at the Guggenheim Museum, the circular nature of the room.
It's like a backdrop.
Yeah, it envelops you. And so I felt like I was a part of the scene, and it made me examine and understand in a deeper way my own power and my own privilege. And you talk about racism. You didn't use this word, but I felt like you were talking about it within microaggressive terms. And Walker's work is macroaggressive. She is blowing it all up, and she is almost creating this Rorschach test where we imprint ourselves and our own experience with that history and that legacy onto the work. And so, of course, it is inflammatory. It is a provocation, and that is exactly what it's intended to do. It's to open up this dialogue and to really reveal the truth of the Reconstruction era.
Kara Walker is born in 1969, so she comes from my exact like generation. So it was kind of like the whole Black Power, Black Power, Black Panthers. Yeah, that's cool, but that was like then. You know what I mean? Now, in a way, Tupac used it as a now thing. But what she said is, no. I don't really, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this. And she's going like way back. She's going way, way, way back into the history and illuminating things on the walls. And by the way, that doesn't really make for the most, for a couple of reasons, the most collectible art, does it? I mean, from a Christie's perspective, right? It doesn't exist on a canvas, so you can't hang it on the wall. That was just my own personal question. Like, how do you collect her work when her work seems like it's done installation to installation, and it is pretty hardcore? So that, like, do you want that on your wall? Like, people don't even want Rembrandts on the wall because of its chiaroscuro and tenebrism. Do you want a Kara Walker on your wall because of its, because of his chiaroscuro of subject?
That's such a good point. And she does work in prints. I know that. I'm not sure if she works on canvas, but I suspect she does. But I think that's another genius of her practice, is that she is really challenging and changing what it means to collect.
And I like that.
Yeah, I like that a
leaving
lot.
it there. Like, we talk about street art. Street art is meant for the streets. It's meant to be on the walls. It's meant to interact with public space. It's meant to co-op public space. My opinion, your opinion, and a lot of graffiti artists and street artists, two different genres, by the way, know that fact. A lot of graffiti artists and street artists will disagree with that, which is fair. But my real opinion is should be kept on the walls. Same with Kara Walker. My opinion is I like the fact that it's living, breathing, and that it is, going to be destroyed.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The site specificity of her work. And to me, there's no greater example of that within her practice than this recent sculptural installation she did in New York. I think it was in Brooklyn. I went. It was one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen.
Wait, you think it was in Brooklyn and you went, so it was in
It was either
Brooklyn.
Queens or Brooklyn. It was a borough. I don't know.
Was it a museum?
It was, no. Then I would know. It was the Domino Sugar Factory, which I think is Brooklyn.
Okay.
Yeah. So what happened is that this Domino Sugar Factory was going to be demolished. And so they gave Kara Walker the opportunity to transform the space as she wanted for a few months prior to the destruction. And she created this work that was so immersive and upsetting and activated all of the senses. It's really one of the coolest things I've ever seen. And it pushed her practice because now she's working with the materials of the factory to honor its history, to honor the history of African Americans within this country, but also to just push her style to sculptures. Yeah.
No, what was that? Was that where it had the African American female Sphinx?
Yeah.
That is pretty dope.
It was phenomenal. So
she didn't do that though.
Well,
she had it done.
She fabricated it, but she designed it.
Right.
Or she did not fabricate it. She had people working.
Yeah, no, of course. That's that. I mean, not one person could do that.
No.
Although one person did build the pyramids. No, I'm kidding. But the point is that I like the fact that she's taken her work to 3D. I'm about it. I think that she pushes, she prods. Sometimes it gets like, damn, or maybe I could see, other African American artists like, but isn't that what it's all about? At the end of the day, provocation. She's getting people up in arms, but come on, what else? What a better thing to do?
Exactly. And it's so important to not minimize the history of racism and to not think that we're done with slavery just because we don't physically enslave. And that there is a legacy imprinted in the cultural heritage of many, many communities. And we need to give that a voice. And I think that Walker's exhibition did that for me in a way that transcended my experience with her silhouettes. So she wanted to honor the history of the factory. And of course, the history of sugar has a really complicated, problematic one because slaves were instructed, they were forced to work in sugar plantations. And so I think that's what attracted her to the Domino Factory in the first place. And It is such a gross space. It looks like it's weeping molasses because it was active for so many decades. And now when you go in, you are just totally transfixed by this disgusting odor. It's just so much. It fills all of your cavities in a matter of seconds. And it's not pleasant. So she made 2 different types of sculptures. Some were these little kids made out of molasses. And as the exhibition moved forward, the molasses was in a process of decay. And so I thought that was really beautiful, seeing this subtle performance. You see the drips, you see the demise, and then the pièce de résistance, this big sphinx female figure, huge monumental sculpture, all made out of domino sugar. And
oh, wow. I didn't know that.
yeah, and so that too was in a process
Can
of
you
crumbling.
lick it?
Probably some people
Probably.
tried. Oh, how diminishing.
It's like the opposite of Willy Wonka. It's like Willy Wonka and the horrible atrocities of Racism Factory.
Yeah.
Which is
really,
kind of crazy.
Which is what
you
it
know
is.
What I mean?
And we talked about Betty Saar and how she used a mammy figure and how Kara Walker did too. So this Sphinx, it has the face of a mammy, which is a stereotypical role that African American women were forced to play. And what I love about Walker's disruption is that mammy figures are historically not sexualized. They're the big women, they're in big aprons, they're there to nurture, to protect.
They're submissive, they're they just follow orders, they're complacent in a lot of ways too.
Yeah, but they're there to encourage and support you, but they are not sexual beings. And Kara Walker's mammy, her Sphinx, is nude. And when you go, because it's a sculpture in the round, and you see her genitalia and you see her very large, prominent breasts. And for the first time, the first time in my consciousness, I saw this stereotypical African-American figure finally have more of a complete identity and to have a sexuality that is appropriate for a woman, for a person, for a sentient being. So I really liked that. I thought that it nuanced the conversation a little bit and encouraged viewers to think about these tropes, these stereotypes in alternate ways.
Well, there you have it. Kara Walker, probably one of the most, as polarizing as she is, she's probably one of the most popular, well-known contemporary artists who is really talking about important issues. I mean, a lot of art is just a lot of art for art's sake, right? The Duchampian art for art's sake, and whether it's a light on the floor but no, seriously, like it's not, and that's fine. Like, Bearden, like you said, an African-American artist who was absolutely freakingly wildly talented and actually my favorite collage artist of all time. He was doing really cool stuff, but it wasn't as politically charged. It was beautiful work. It was important work. It was significant and reflective of the times historically, but it wasn't as politically charged and certainly not as polarizing. And I think that's what she brings to the table. She makes us think. And, really good art makes us think. It doesn't matter if it makes us think about how fucked up this country was or how beautiful music is. The fact is, it makes us think.
And I think therein lies really the power and the legacy of her offerings is that she encourages dialogue. And I think we feel so inflamed with issues of racism or sexism, and especially in today's time, you're either with me or you're attacking me. And I can fall victim to that too. And I think Walker's work, that's why it's so charged, because you can't look at it and not have an opinion. And if you're supportive of it, does that mean you're racist? And so it's difficult. These conversations are hard to have, but they are necessary. They are absolutely central. And so that's what I think is so brave about her. And she just does it in such a smart way. And the new iteration of her work, turning to the sculptural, I'm really excited to see what happens.
Check her out. If you don't know, now you know. Peace.